Testing 1, 2, 3. Check, check. Hello, hello. Hey, Coldest. How are you doing today? Welcome to, this is a brand new stream, just started last week, and we are going through the process of the visual study notes that I use when I study to create sermons for your church when I guest teach once a month. And I go through this process of studying visually because that's how I think. I'm a visual person. So just chilling. Yeah. It's pretty late over there, huh? I think visually, so this is how I can see connections and make sense of things. And doing things this way also helps me to see things that I wouldn't have seen by just reading text and just reading commentaries on things. So it's very helpful to get some really interesting insights on things. So I've started this stream to help teach you how I do it, so that if you're interested in doing this yourself as a way of studying the Bible and learning it more in depth than we do just by our cursory reading, then you can do so as well. Last week, I was mostly doing an overview last week of how I set it up. So if you want to check that out, you can. It's on the VR Church YouTube, or it's in the video on demand here on the Twitch stream as well. But we spent a lot of time last week going over what I'd already studied, and then also we spent some time looking more into this question of what is divine heart hardening. Because the question was, does God harden people's hearts? And if so, why would he do that? It seems like that would be a main thing to do, to harden people's hearts, to keep them from accepting him. But we did some in-depth study on that, and then I went back and added some notes on that afterwards. So I would like to go over that really quick before I summarize what I've done since then, because we stopped at verse 18. But the whole question of hardening hearts was, would he do it? And by studying the resources that we found last week, we found resources from Bible Project. They talked about Pharaoh's case study for hardened hearts. And it seems like besides just this one, every single example of where it talks about people's hearts being hardened or God hardening people's hearts in the Bible, they did it first themselves. They always did it first themselves. They hardened their own hearts, and God gave them multiple chances, way more chances than we would give people to turn back and see the error of their ways. And he gave them multiple chances, way more than we would, and they still continued to harden their hearts. So then that's when, okay, you've made your decision. And everything that we study, here's one thing that's very important, and I've added it as a note here so that when I study everything, I need to remember this, that anything that we study in the Bible should be taken into the context of the greatest command. Matthew 22:37 says, Jesus declared, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your intelligence. In that itself, the word intelligence means we need to be thinking for ourselves. And Matthew 22:39-40, the second command is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And that the law and the prophets was their term for Old Testament. All of the documents that we know as the Old Testament now were called the law and prophets back then. And so this says that everything, all of the law and the prophets hang on these two commands, which means that every command, every rule that we see in the Bible, everything that happens in the Bible that God does or that Jesus does or that he commands people to do is all hanging on this whole concept of love for the Lord your God and for love for your neighbor as yourself. So when we study anything that seems like it's putting God in a cruel light, it most likely means that we just don't understand and we need to dig in further in that area to figure out, if we can, why this is happening, what do we not understand about it, and then if we can't understand, there are some things that we're not going to understand, and in that case we would just need to trust that God is working in this heart of love and that we just don't understand because we don't see everything that he sees. And also God knows our hearts way better than we do. He knows our motivations better than we do. We can easily fool ourselves into what our motivations are for doing things. And he knows us better than we know ourselves. So regardless of this divine hard hardening and whether God's doing it or whether we're doing it, we are always the one to harden our own heart first, and we are responsible for the evil in our own hearts. And did another study on, there was a cross-reference to Romans 9:18 that said, so then he shows mercy to whom he wants and he hardens whom he wants. God's purposes can't be thwarted by evil. And that was, Pharaoh was doing a whole lot of evil back then. And God's purposes can't be thwarted by that, including Christ's crucifixion. If those hearts had not been hardened, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the ones who denied him, if they had not done that, it's quite probable or possible that Christ's crucifixion would have never happened if those hearts weren't hardened. Because if they had all accepted him as Messiah, then we'd have a very different history. We can't understand everything that he's doing, and we also can't assume that we know his intentions and that we know his plan. We just have to trust that he's doing what's right and what's just, because he is a loving and a just God, and he knows our hearts, and he will make the just decision regardless of whether we understand it or not. And that also doesn't mean that a heart has to stay hardened. And one of the things that I found interesting was the whole point of the book of Matthew is that it was targeted towards the Jews who had rejected him at this point in history. And the fact that Matthew was tasked to write to the Jews, again, the whole point of this book of Matthew is to write to the Jews to prove Jesus Messiah. So if their hearts could not be softened again, there was no point for Matthew to target it towards them. He could have just targeted it towards everyone else. So the fact that he did write that means that there is still a chance for a softening to happen again once a heart is hardened. But God knows, again, our heart's better than we do. And we need to trust that he will make just decisions. And I have a cross reference there to a prophecy. Where is it? I've got so many. Here, let me click on it. Down here. Okay. Isaiah 16:5. A trustworthy king will be established. He will rule in a reliable manner. This is one from David's family. He will be sure to make just decisions and will be experienced in executing justice. So he's going to be good and righteous in his judgments, regardless of our opinions, regardless of what we think, because again, we don't know what's going on in people's hearts. But we can trust that he does, and we can trust that he is a loving and just and good God who will do what is the right thing to do. So now, I want to pick up and summarize what we left off at 18. So the whole chapter of chapter 13 is, we had just learned in 11 and 12, we read through various people rejecting Jesus as Messiah. The Jews, just constant stories of people rejecting Jesus as Messiah, regardless of the fact that throughout the whole rest of the book, he had been fulfilling prophecy left and right. He had been in public, in front of everyone who knew the prophecies forward and backwards, yet they still chose to reject him. That's why we were talking about hardened hearts. And so he changed his strategy and started speaking in parables. And the reason that he started speaking in parables was, first of all, it was a very traditional thing for prophets to speak in parables to reveal truths from God. And this is what he was doing. But it was also because the fact that the Jews could not accept Jesus as Messiah, this was the foundational basic truth of everything, that you have to accept Jesus as Messiah. If you don't, you can't understand anything else about his kingdom, because it's all based on that simple fact. And so he changed his strategy to meet this. He had two audiences. He had the hostile audience who was convinced that he was a lunatic, and he had the open-minded audience who was his followers. And these parables intrigued them and stimulated dialogue. They would go to him later and ask questions. What does this mean? And they would, and he would answer when they sincerely asked. And 13 is broken up into two sections. It's broken up into a section where he's speaking to the crowds, but he doesn't explain the parables to the crowds. And then he does later explain them to his followers. And he speaks more parables to his followers, but also explains them. Because if you can't accept that simple truth of Jesus as Messiah, you're not going to be able to understand anything else. It's just not going to make sense. It's going to be malarkey. And you're going to be in this category of, he's crazy. And so that's the context. And so the explanation of the parables for his followers, and the parable that we were talking about was, I use a Net Bible. That's one of my sources. Very good translation and very good notes. So he had just been talking about the parable of sower. That was the one, right? The thorns. Let's see. Right, yeah, it was this one. A sower went out to sow, and he sowed some seeds. And as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. And other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they didn't have much soil. They sprang up quickly because the soil was not deep. But when the sun came out, they were scorched, and because they didn't have sufficient root, they withered. And then other seeds fell along the thorns, and they grew up and choked them. But other seeds fell on good soil and produced some 100 times as much, some 60, some 30. The one who has ears had better listen. And so my notes from that, I like to take notes in post-it form because they're short, concise, and again, it's visual. So I'm just getting key concepts so that I can think about it and remember. But this is a revelation that he was giving, and let's go ahead and read 18. So listen to the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word about the kingdom and doesn't understand it, the evil one comes and snatches what is sown in his heart. And the evil one here, and interestingly, the synoptic parallels each use of the different word for a Satan here. Mark 4:15 has Satan, while Luke 8:12 has the devil. And this illustrates the fluidity of the gospel tradition in often using synonyms for the same point. It's just different people using different terms. It doesn't mean it's a different person or entity. But the enemy here is Satan. Comes and snatches what was sown in his heart. This is the seed sown along the path. And the seed sown along the rocky ground is the person who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. But he has no root in himself and doesn't endure. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, immediately he falls away. The seed sown among thorns is the person who hears the word, but worldly cares and the seductiveness of wealth choke the word, so it produces nothing. But as for the seed sown on good soil, this is the person who hears the word and understands. He bears fruit, yielding 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. So in my notes, I have this parable is talking about something that even former prophets wanted to know, these things. Not even the prophets of the Old Testament, the big prophets that we read about that wrote the big books in the Old Testament, the prophecies, didn't know this, and they wanted to. And the unbelievers, people who didn't believe in Messiah, weren't able to understand this because they didn't, again, have that basic truth in them. They didn't accept that, so they wouldn't be able to accept anything else. And it was important to Jesus that his followers did understand this. And the soils in verse 19 mean that reception to his teaching, and it's talking about the state of the heart. These people are open-minded to his word. They accept him as Messiah, and so they are open to learning from him and his truth about the kingdom. And the hard soil represents hard hearts. Satan snatched the message away before they could understand it. And then the rocky ground meant that they didn't have enough adequate rooting in the truth. And initially, they were enthusiastic, and they did show spiritual growth, but they failed to continue to follow faithfully. They failed to continue growing. So one of the many ways that we grow is spending time studying his word to get to know him, spending time fellowshipping with other believers to learn and grow from them. And then when you don't do these exercises to grow spiritually and get that deep foundational root in you, anytime, as soon as some kind of trouble comes along the way, you're going to lose your faith and you're going to fall away. And then among the thorns meant that we're allowing the distractions of the world to crowd out Jesus and his teachings. We put the concerns of our life before our spiritual development. I'm too busy. I don't have time to read the Bible. I'm too busy. I don't have time to go to church. I don't have time to go to Bible study. I don't have time to pray to Jesus. I don't have time for this. Because we're putting all of these other things first. And we can't see the long-term gains of these things, spending time with God, spending time studying his teachings to us, spending time with other people so that we can grow together. We don't see the long-term gains over that. We're too short-sighted and we don't see the importance of it. We only care about the short-term losses of what we would lose if we put God first. And it's temporary treasure versus eternal future treasure. And these distractions can drain our spiritual vitality before we realize it. Anyone, even, it doesn't mean that they didn't accept him as Messiah. And it doesn't mean that they won't necessarily go to heaven. It means that they've allowed the world to distract them and keep them from growing. Ivor Miland, I don't know if I said that right. So would you agree with this statement? Faith is not opposed to works, it is opposed to earning. Yeah, faith is shown in good works. You can't earn your salvation. Is that what you mean? Is that what you're saying? You can't earn your salvation. It is by Jesus' gift alone. We just have to accept it. We just have to accept he's Messiah. Is that what you're talking about? And then the good soil is the person understands the message about the kingdom and they respond appropriately. They do accept him as Messiah. And so they join the ranks of the sowers. And if we reference back to Matthew 9, where it talked about the need for workers for the harvest, and the workers that he says, pray for workers for the harvest because the harvest is great, but there aren't enough workers. These are these people. These are these people that we are. This is the good soil where it does take root. These are, and these new people, these workers become the sowers to sow new seeds. And the sowers should expect varied results. And that's what it was talking about in here, where it's talking about 100 or 60 or 30 times what's grown. You're gonna have varied results based on the receptiveness of people. And just because one person has 30 doesn't mean that they are not considered successful in their sowing. We don't have control over how people receive the gospel. All we can do is sow the seeds. And the degree of productivity will vary. And a reference to this is Matthew 21 through 15. I've only got 12 through 13 here because that's a really long quote. These last fellows worked 1 hour. It's talking about when he hired workers throughout the day, and some started in the morning, some in the afternoon, and some right like an hour before the workday was finished. And these last fellows worked 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who bore the hardship and the burning heat of the day. And the landowner replied to one of them, friend, I am not treating you unfairly. Didn't you agree with me to work for the standard wage? And he's treating us all equally regardless. And that's kind of a reference to earning. So Ivor Milan says, sort of, you can't earn your salvation, but most people, when you try to do good, jump on you and say you're trying to earn salvation. So would that stop you? That is sad. That is sad. Because people are trying to say you're trying to earn it. But it's not, we have no right to assume other people's intentions, assume what's going on in other people's hearts. And the people that are doing that are incorrect. They've made an assumption. And it's sad. So the question is, would you still do those good works regardless? That's the question we should all ask ourselves. Why are we doing these things? Are we doing these things because, as all of us need to ask that, what are our intentions? Again, that goes back to we can fool ourselves for our intentions. Are we doing it for human praise? Are we doing it because it's the right thing to do, because it's what God wants us to do? And I guess does that help or hurt at all? And so then Jesus commands all of the people who hear the message and believe. He commends them. Sorry, I read that wrong. He's saying good that you've done this, and increasing understanding and proper response will happen as you grow spiritually. You will gain more understanding of these mysteries that he's speaking of. It's difficult. I agree. It is difficult to take. It's very difficult to take, and it's disheartening and it's discouraging. Do you have other people you can hang around to help build you up and encourage you? If not, you're welcome. Either way, you're welcome to join us on our Discord. Oldest, you still there? Can you add the Discord in there if you're not already in there? And then the parable of the weeds was the next one. And he presented them with another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a person who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, an enemy came and sowed darnel among the wheat and went away. Darnel is a certain kind of plant. And when the plant sprouted and produced grain, the darnel also appeared. It's a weed plant. So the slaves of the landowner came and said to him, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Then where did the darnel come from?" He said, "An enemy has done this." So the slaves replied, "Do you want us to go and gather it?" But he said, "No, since in the gathering the darnel, you may uproot the wheat along with it. Let both grow together until the harvest. At harvest time, I will tell the reapers, first collect the darnel and tie it in bundles to be burned, but then gather the wheat into my barn." And this is another mystery about the kingdom of heaven. And this is happening during the church age, which we're in right now. Here, let me type the Discord in here. That's the Discord link if you want to join us. discord.gg/vrmmo. And this is alluding to there being a period of time before the kingdom arrives from when Jesus arrived. And this is kind of new information that was revealed. It's not information that was revealed in the Old Testament specifically, or it wasn't clear at all, at least as far as I'm aware. And as far as the notes that were taken, that I studied the constable's notes, and he mentioned that this was something that wasn't mentioned. But if I'm wrong, let me know. Kingdom will face hard hearts, competing pressures, and failures of people. And it will nevertheless produce an abundant crop. And that's what this whole parable of the wheats is about. And the Jews expected the kingdom to begin immediately, which is another reason that they were rejecting him as Messiah, because they wanted it. They wanted certain things. They wanted specific things to happen, and he wasn't doing what they expected, so they rejected him. It's just really sad. So let's. So the literal translation of kingdom of this first, the kingdom of heaven is like. Literal translation is the kingdom of heaven has become like, and that kind of indicates a change in the program from what it was supposed to be, and that was as a result of Israel's rejection of Messiah. It doesn't mean that God didn't know that was going to happen, but that's what he wanted to have. He wanted Israel to accept him. It doesn't mean he didn't know that was going to happen, but it did indicate, well, this is a change because you didn't do what I hoped. You did what I know you were going to do, but you didn't do what I hoped. And the parable is describing Christendom in general, about the weeds and the darnel. You're welcome. While everyone was sleeping, and this to me, so these purple notes, again, for reference, are my personal thoughts. So that doesn't mean that it is something that I found in studies. It's just, these are my personal thoughts. So have we become too distracted to notice the enemy sneaking into our midst? Are we paying attention? This can happen with lies mixed with biblical truths. It can happen, again, while we're so distracted with our daily lives, putting concerns of our own life in front of our spiritual development, things like that. I made a mental connection of that. Are we too distracted? Because it says while everyone was sleeping. And then the darnel is a weed that looks a lot like wheat when it's young, but when it grows, it can't be distinguished easily from wheat when it's young, but as it grows and matures, you can definitely tell there is a clear distinction between the two. But at that point, the roots are so intertwined with the wheat that you can't pull one up without hurting the other one. And that means that the enemy has fully mixed the darnel seeds and with the wheat seeds. And the field owner wouldn't know until both were arriving at maturity. And the workers in the field, when it says they came up to ask him, what, didn't you sow good seeds? They're wondering what could have happened, because I thought you'd sown good seeds here. So Ivanlon says Hebrew thought and Greek thought are a bit different. I don't think so much new was revealed as most of Old Testament was clarified by Christ. That's possible. It's a new understanding, maybe, is another way of saying it. Things that they didn't understand before, things that they weren't clarified before. We are certainly more in line with the Greek than Hebrew thought in the Western world. Definitely, especially nowadays. It seems to just cycle and repeat. And then the owner recognized that the enemy had done this, but he hadn't recognized it until he saw that the wheat was growing and it was already near maturity. So at that point, it was too late to do anything about it. The roots were too intertwined, and he would have to wait and separate them at harvest time. And the reapers would gather and burn the weeds first, and then they would put all of the good wheat in the storehouse. And then the parable of the mustard seed was he gave them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest garden plant and becomes a tree, so that the wild birds come and nest in its branches. So this is a classification of plants. It is not the biggest tree, obviously, but it is the greatest that is considered a garden plant. Oops. I do use Bible Hub as well. I love it because you can quickly cross-reference the words with the Greek lexicon or Hebrew. And so the mustard seed is incredibly tiny. It's about the size of a pinhead. And it is a metaphor to represent very small beginnings. And he told them it was because of your little, in Matthew 17:20 is another place where it references the mustard seed. Because it was because of your little faith. I tell you the truth. If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, and I think this was referring to that time when they weren't able to cast out a demon or something that needed much prayer. I think this is the reference, going off memory. I tell you the truth, if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. So it's very small beginnings of your faith. And the mustard plant can grow up to 10 to 12 feet, and that's when the wild birds would often use them to nest in. And this was something that they knew in their culture of the time. They understood this because it was a common thing. And the tree with this tree with birds flocking to the branches is a common metaphor that's used in the Old Testament to represent any kind of kingdom that is perceived as great. And the birds represent those people, those who seek shelter in the kingdom. And then the Jews did correctly believe that the Messianic kingdom would be very large and it would be great. And Jesus could have chosen a larger plant to illustrate, but the main point that he chose the mustard seed was because of its very, very small beginning, and that is a contrast between your beginning and your maturity as you grow. That's the whole point. And then Jesus's ministry was this was relating it to the kingdom. His ministry had a very, very small beginning, and that small beginning would end up becoming a worldwide kingdom as predicted in the Old Testament. And Jesus's life and ministry, again, didn't fit in with the Jews' expectations that the kingdom would be very large very quickly, was their expectation. And then the parable of the yeast He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed with 3 measures of flour until all the dough had risen. I keep clicking on the wrong thing. This is a very small amount of yeast that is needed to create bread. I've made bread before from scratch, and you only need a very small amount of yeast, and it can grow into something really big. And these small, again, it's another reference to small beginnings growing into something exponential. And it is a misconception that yeast is always used to represent evil, because again, with the leavened and the unleavened bread that's mentioned for my brain just went blank, for the supper, Lord's Supper, that's not the only use of it. We also use it. It was in Leviticus in the Old Testament. It was used as loaves of bread made from the first grain baked with yeast were accepted offerings. It specifically mentioned that in the Old Testament as an accepted offering. And it's another metaphor for how the kingdom will survive and grow. And mixed with, this literal root word for mixed with, that it says the yeast mixed in with the flour, is hidden. Hidden means there's this internal change that takes place that we can't see. We can only see the results of the change. We can't see the actual change that's happening. And we have to trust that God is working even when we don't see it. He will bless our labor for his kingdom. Even if we don't see it right now, he will bless it if we continue to work towards it for his good and his glory. And then he goes on to describe the purpose of the parables. Jesus spoke all these things in parables to the crowds. He did not speak to them without a parable. This fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will announce what has been hidden from the foundation of the world. And this was, Matthew is stressing here the importance that he was only speaking in parables, and that was a fulfillment of a prophecy. Again, they're unable to understand these bigger revelations, these hidden mysteries, because they couldn't understand that basic and very, very clear revelation of Jesus as Messiah. Because again, he had done this. He had demonstrated publicly throughout his entire ministry, he was Messiah. God announced it vocally when he was baptized, and there were many witnesses to that. When he was born, angels proclaimed it. People heard actual angels proclaim it. They heard God say, this is Messiah. But they did, and they saw him grow. They saw him do all of these public fulfillments of prophecy, but they still rejected him. And until they can accept him, they won't be able to receive any more truth. So that's why he's speaking in parables. And that quote that he mentioned is a quote from Psalm 78 that was written by Asaph. Let's see. Everyone says it can be for both good and evil. I think beware the yeast of the Pharisees. Yeah, they used it for both. It was also something Jesus said. Oh, beware the yeast of the Pharisees. That was something he said. I believe it. Matthew is here using Israel's history to teach them of their consistently rebellious nature towards God, and God's consistently merciful attitude towards them. He's using the parables, comparing various things. Asaph was doing this, Asaph was using that. And he was putting things together in new ways to teach things that were previously not understood. That's what you were talking about earlier, Ivan. The religious Jews would immediately know this reference and that he's quoting here. And Jesus was doing the same thing. He was teaching lessons. There were new lessons, but not entirely new things. And he was revealing some truths about the kingdom by bringing things together in new ways. He was kind of like how I do by this visual thing. I can make connections that I never had before. He's doing this by making different connections to help people understand things in new, different ways that they never understood before. And he's throwing light on the kingdom by doing this. And this was a fulfillment of yet another prophecy from Psalm this time. So again, another fulfillment of prophecy that he's Messiah. And so now we're getting into verse 36, where Jesus starts explaining to the disciples what these things mean. And he separated this explanation from the telling of it in the book so that we could be more clear to understand what parables he was speaking to the general crowds versus which ones he was speaking directly to his followers. So verse 36, that's where I stopped in my studies. Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him saying, "Explain to us the parable of the darnel on the field." He answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the people of the kingdom." The field is often referred to as the world. I've seen it in other places. "The poisonous weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. As the poisonous weeds are collected and burned with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather from his kingdom everything that causes sin, as well as all lawbreakers. They will throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. The one who has ears had better listen." Where are we? We're on 36. Okay. In Constable's notes, this is what I use here for my study. One of the sources I use. Jesus now removed himself from the crowds by re-entering the house. So he said he left the crowds and went into the house. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to say separated from crowds by entering house. And so, yeah, I'm just making simple notes here. This was evidently in Capernaum, from which he had departed to teach the multitudes. And this was also his hometown. There he explained 3 of the parables and taught his disciples 4 more. Jesus' disciples were not different from the crowd because they immediately understood the parables. They were different because they persisted in asking Jesus to help them understand the parables, whereas the crowds showed less interest. That's what we referenced earlier about open-mindedness. People, he had 2 audiences, the ones that were open-minded and the ones that were hostile. So disciples weren't different because they immediately understood parables, understood meaning. They were different because they persisted and asked questions. And then I'm going to make a cross reference to, if I can, it's kind of long. Open-mindedness. And then I'll make a note here if I can. May not let me. The difference in the followers. That way I know the reference without having to follow the line. And that cross references back to open-mindedness. And then it had mentioned the crowds. Showed less interest. Okay, let's see. Ivor Milan says, on the subject of bread, Jesus also calls us to split the salt of the earth, and one of the things that salt does is enhance the flavor and preserve food. It also limits the spread of yeast in a loaf so that the yeast doesn't take over and ruin the taste in a loaf. But you can still get the rise. The science of mixing bread, when you look at the symbols of the grain dying in the earth only to rise again 100-fold. The role of oil as the Holy Spirit also needed in bread. You get a very deep theological picture. That's cool. Thanks for sharing. Is that not mentioned? That's mentioned somewhere, isn't it? Where's that reference? I think that's referenced somewhere. Okay. They were not interested. Why did Jesus continue to teach his believing disciples by parables rather than with straightforward explanations? Okay, that's a good question. Why didn't he switch to plain talk for his followers? Evidently, so many people were following Jesus that whenever he spoke, except in private, a mixed audience heard him. He was in his house, so I'm wondering if there was still a mixed audience in his house. It wasn't his house, it was somebody's house. I don't think he had a house per se. His family may have. That would have been a mixed audience. Okay. He was usually in a mixed audience unless in a private setting. So we're assuming that even in the house, I'll make that my assumption, that it was in a mixed audience, even in the house. Okay. And I think we had a reference to that in chapter 12, where even not all of his family accepted him as Messiah. I think that James didn't fully accept him until after he rose from the dead. I'm not sure. I think he was a skeptic at first. Let's see. 37 through 39. 37 through 39 is explaining. He's explaining. So Jesus identified himself as both the sower and the director of the harvest. So he's the sower and the director of the harvest. So the one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. So we're not the sowers. So should I fix that? Hold on. I don't know if I should fix that. I'll make that a question mark. And do that. Okay. And I have a cross-reference here from earlier that was mentioned earlier in the notes that I wanted to put in context. This is again. He's calling himself the Son of Man, which is a direct reference to Messiah. And he is saying this Son of Man, or we'll just say Messiah, is both sower and harvester. Let's see. We're almost out of time here. So he took these Old Testament figures for God and applied them to himself. God had been referenced as in the Old Testament as the sower and the director of the harvest. Yeah, the Lord of the harvest. That's the reference. This is OT references to God. Jesus is referencing, applying to self. Everyone says Son of Man is a direct reference to one of Daniel's visions. Yeah. And where it's talking about the Messiah. And then this is a direct cross-reference. The sower and the director of the harvest is mentioned again in Matthew 9:37 through 38. Then he said to his disciples, I'll fix that. So it's, I do capitals on Jesus and God, so that I can easily distinguish between who I'm talking about here, who's being talked about. And it's a respect thing, but it's not a legalistic thing. It's just so I can understand who are we talking about here. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore, I ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest-ready fields. Okay. The field is the world where the sowing takes place, but the wheat and the tares represent true and only professing believers. The wheat and the tares, is that the weeds? They're using different translation probably in their notes. And the field was represented in, I think it was in 9 as well as, no, it was earlier in this chapter. Maybe. Yeah. World is referred to as a field or a wilderness in the first parable. We as true believers. I don't remember now what confused me. I don't remember. That's no problem. I think I was looking at where there was another reference for field, maybe? And it was up earlier in the chapter. Field is the world where the sowing takes place, but the wheat and the tares represent true and only professing believers. So the wheat is the true believer, and the weeds, the darnel, those who only say they believe. They don't actually believe. Say or pretend. I don't know if that's the right word. Say, those who only say or pretend. This brief statement presupposes a mission beyond Israel and confirms that the narrower command of 10:5-6, which was Jesus sent out these 12, instructing them as follows: do not go on a road that leads to Gentile regions, and do not enter any Samaritan town. Go instead to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So this narrow command is related exclusively to the mission of the 12 during the period of Jesus' earthly ministry. That makes sense because he does say later to go out into the world. Okay. So this... Okay. What verses are we on? We're still on 37 through 39. Okay. It implies that there will be a wider mission to go to the world. Milan says, it is interesting that the weeds and the wheat can't be harvested until after they show their true colors, but I think that is for our benefit to see why some make it and others don't. I think we will see one day. We'll all see. We'll all see. We'll all be standing before him in the future at some point, and we'll all see. We might have to wait on that answer. But regardless, we can trust that he's going to do what's right. Even though it's hard to do that. Presupposes a mission beyond Israel and confirms that the narrow command. So let's see, I'm going to take this cross-reference. This is another reason I like Net Bible, is I can do that quick cross-reference without having to like leave this chapter and go there. And all of my quotes are in white, on white post-its. I have a color code. Okay, so that's a cross-reference, but mission given to 12 in chapter 10, specifically or during Jesus' time on earth. So it's not a contradiction as some may think. I don't know if some people do think that. They might. Notice particularly that the field is not the church, field is not the church. Sorry, egg picker, but that's nowhere in Revelation. That's nowhere in Revelation. They don't mention the metaverse in the Bible at all, actually. But they do mention going out to all the corners of the earth and everywhere that people are to spread the love of God to them and preach. I can find the Great Commission for you if you'd like. Go into all the world, including the digital world, because that's where people are. We're called to go to the people. The field is not the church. The identification of the field as the church was common in the writings of some early church father. Okay. So that would be a misconception. Okay, so I color code misconceptions in red or pink. Field represents the church. Field is the world. Okay. The identification of the field as the church was common in the writings of some early church fathers and in those of some reformers. It was a common belief in some early church fathers, and I'm assuming this is in this is post generation 1. And in some reformers. And it's quite popular with many modern critical, evangelical, and even dispensational scholars. Okay, I'm just going to copy that. Okay, I think that it is incorrect. This is Thomas Constable's thoughts now. It is incorrect since the kingdom predicted in the Old Testament is distinctly different from the church. Okay. So I'm going to say Constable thinks this is incorrect because kingdom, N-O-T, kingdom mentioned, N-O-T, is distinctly different from the church. I'm capitalizing the church to, represent Christendom and not a individual church. Milan said, I'm not certain if they are entirely right about the field not being the church unless they want to take the stance that the church is only those that follow Christ, in which case there's still some interesting questions that arise about if the church is only the people and not the organizations. There are a lot of people in the church that are not believers. Is that what you're saying? Which is true. That's true. And okay. So this parable does not teach that there will be a mixture of good and evil in the church. True believers and only professing believers. The terms world, church, and kingdom are all distinct in the New Testament. This parable does not teach that there will be a mixture of good and evil in the church, true believers and only professing believers. This English isn't working for me. Can you understand what this is saying? I don't understand what this is saying. The terms world, church, and kingdom are distinct in the New Testament. The good seed represents the sons of the kingdom, namely those destined for the kingdom, not those presently in the kingdom. Okay. Some are believers, but even the devils believe and shudder. Yeah. I'm having trouble with this sentence. My brain isn't functioning right now, or it's not a clear sentence. This parable does not teach that there will be a mixture of good and evil in the church, true believers and only professing believers. Belief alone is not enough unless it's faith belief. Yeah, agree. Yeah. The good, right? Where the sons of the kingdom are Jewish unbelievers. The field is the world, and the good seed are the people of the kingdom. The good seeds, the seeds that grow in the good soil, I think is what they mean. So let's see here. Let's see. I think we're running into predestination and free will debate. Maybe some of the stance by the commentators can only be read by a hard belief in one or the other. Yeah, I'm not sure where Constable stands on this. Yeah. And they are trying, I think they usually try to clarify when it's their opinion versus something that is like studied and is understood. So, which is why I think this is incorrect. But I would say, either way, that it's not only the church. Would you say that? Field is not only the church. Would you say that, Iramala? The identification of the field as the church was a common. Yeah, I have a hard time with the sentence. I might have to come back and read it later. Maybe my brain will work later. I think yes, but the church lives in the field. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. The good seed represents the sons of the kingdom, namely those destined for the kingdom. I'm wondering if they're coming from the stance, because where I grew up, there was this strong belief. I grew up in a very legalistic church who was separatist. So this comes. I'm wondering if he's talking about separatism. Do you understand what I mean by separatism? That's where you don't hang out in the world with the heathens, basically, is what I grew up in. And so the field in that case would be the church. I'm wondering if that's where he's coming from on this. Is that whole separatism versus going out into the world, which is our calling. That could be it. I need to understand more about him, more about Thomas Constable. But so far, I've got access to McLaren and Matthew Henry as well. my favorite has been Constable so far, just because of the clarity of his notes and how easily organized it is, and how he breaks up what other people believe versus what he believes, whereas the other ones are less clear on that. So it just makes it easier to study from his notes. And it is okay if we disagree on stuff, as long as we're clarifying what's our thought versus what the Bible actually says. Okay. So I think that this is probably a good place to stop, because I don't want to lose that thought. Let's see. I'm wondering if he's referring. So I will make the question: is Constable referring to, can't even spell, separatism, which is something I grew up with. Yeah. And then that, or so we don't get too in the weeds here. Haha, that was a terrible pun. Let's see. So the distinction is very meaningful. I have a concordance, so I have some resources for study. It's helpful when comparing ideas. Yeah, so let's see. Do we have... No, we don't have. The field is the world, and the good seed are the people of the kingdom. And I mean, that's what he's saying. The field is the world. Let's see, does he say what the... And by the world, that means everyone. And that wouldn't just include the church. So I've made the note. That it's only the church. Maybe that's what he's talking about. So I'm gonna make a note here. Let's see. Now draw shapes. What I want is this bracket, so I'm just going to copy the bracket. And I'm going to make a note, because I'm not sure it's fully relevant. This is his argument. Not sure if fully relevant, but could be. Could still be. So I'm leaving it. And I changed the direction of this. Thought you could change the text direction. But, oh well. Okay. There is a library that they have, but I think that you have to pay for it. Oh, I don't know. Maybe you don't have to pay for it. But I don't see links or anything. Oh, okay. See, these notes are broken down, which is nice. The field is the world. This is a key for understanding the parables. It's not the church, but the world. Let's see, Matthew 13:47. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was cast into the sea that caught all kinds of fish. So I would say the way he says that is better. It's not the church, but the world. I like how he says it better. It makes it more clear that it's not just the church. So maybe that is what they're talking about. I would want to study it more before taking a hard stance. Yeah, agree. But by contrast, you get the lambs and the goats, which shows that some people seem familiar with theological stances, yet are rejected. Their fruit didn't produce, no grain heads on them, so to speak. Yeah, people can understand theological stuff, just like you were saying earlier. I mean, even the demons can quote scripture, and they knew exactly who the Messiah was. And that's another thing. When he went to cast out that one demon, I think it was Legion. Not one demon, it was multiple demons. It was in that one man in the cemetery, and he was saying, "Are you here to?" They were saying something about. They knew exactly who he was. I don't remember exactly what they said, but they knew exactly who he was. And so even the demons know who he is. And that was yet another proof of who he is. Because they knew that he had power over them, which is more proof. And it was public proof because he had people following him and seeing and saw him. So there's so much proof. And yet they still reject. Yeah. Yeah, I prefer not to take hard stances on things until I study it. I agree. But I have another thing in just over half an hour, so I am going to have to wrap up. Did you have any other comments or thoughts or questions or anything? The good seed represents the sons of the kingdom, namely those destined for the kingdom, not those presently in the kingdom. The messianic kingdom has not yet begun. Compare 8:12, but the sons of the kingdom will be thrown out into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So there's another reference to weeping and gnashing of teeth. I guess those are the poisonous weeds. Oh, they're poisonous. Okay. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, namely Satan. The sons of the kingdom are Jewish unbelievers, namely the Jews who should have been destined for the kingdom, but were unbelievers in Jesus. They didn't accept him as Messiah. Not all unbelievers are called children of the devil. Only those who have willfully rejected the light are so designated. That's something important to point out. Ivermilon says, I like that you're making notes as you go. I would love to do that myself so that I don't have to rely only on memory. Yeah, and I do refer to these too. And like I did say earlier, I don't know if you were here, this is how I study for sermons that and the pastors use these notes for as well, like DJ, Soto, and so forth. They use these as well for notes. So, because I study visually, so doing it this way helps me see connections, like that's what these connecting lines are, visually see things that I wouldn't by just reading, and then I can refer back to them because I've gone back and referred to other of my notes as well to check something if I remember it. Like I have a board on Matthew 9 that I could go check if I need to about something. It's faster than trying to dig through Constable's notes or anything. It would be helpful when I get constantly asked the same questions or challenges over and over to just have a ready answer. Yeah, and doing this also helps me remember to some extent. But then I can easily go back and refer because it's visual this way. It's easier to find stuff because it's short, concise notes on Post-its. It's easier to find than it is digging through a book. So it's beneficial to do things this way. And so that's one of the reasons I'm doing this stream, is to teach other people how to do it. And so you're seeing how I'm doing this. Miro has a free account that lets you create 3 boards. But if you want to make more boards, they do charge. But there are other tools out there that you could use that you could use as well. Like Jamboard is on Google. It's not as, you can't make a board as big as this. You can only do it like slide size. But that's another option, and it's free. It's called Jamboard. But Miro, you can make a really big, I mean, that's a lot of space. You can have one board have a ton of space. And now I can't find my notes. There they are. And then there's a ton of space. So you can do a ton with one board, and they give you 3 free. So if you do want to start doing that, that's an option. And you can share them, and you can export them to PDFs and so forth, whatever. Excel, whatever. And you can add like screenshots and stuff. I've done that before, pictures, PDFs, things like that. So it's a cool tool. I like it. Thanks for hanging out with me. I am going to need to end the stream because I've got to eat before my next thing. I appreciate it. Thanks, and have a good evening.